I always believed my sacrifices kept my family together until the night my daughter pulled out her phone and showed me 2 years' worth of bank statements. $72,000 sent for me, but I'd never seen a single penny. And when I checked the house deed the next morning, the truth hit me harder than any betrayal ever could. My own son had taken my money and was living in my house without ever telling me. That was the moment everything changed. When Raymond passed away, the house turned into a hollow shell of memories. It wasn't just the silence that pressed in on me, but the overwhelming space that once held laughter, footsteps, and the occasional disagreement. Now it echoed with emptiness. I was 65 years old, a widow, too soon living alone in the same small Tennessee town where Raymond and I had built our life. The neighbors checked in now and then, church services filled some Sundays, but most of my days melted into a routine of tending to my little garden. Watering the petunias, trimming the roses, and pulling weeds gave me a reason to get out of bed. At least with flowers I could nurture something and watch it bloom in return. But no matter how beautiful the blooms, nights always arrived like a thief. The quiet after dusk felt heavier, and the ache in my chest seemed to grow roots in the silence. That was when the memories crept in, both comforting and painful. Memories of raising Elijah and Audrey, our 2 children, who had once filled this house with noise and chaos. After Raymond died, there was no option to fall apart. Life didn't pause for grief, and bills certainly didn't. I had to push through for them. Elijah was the firstborn, the apple of his father's eye. From a young age, he had a knack for getting into little troubles. Nothing too serious at first. A broken window here, a lost textbook there. I always thought he'd grow out of it. But as the years went on, those troubles didn't fade. They grew. Missed car payments, bad credit decisions, friends who conveniently vanished after borrowing money. Every time Elijah showed up at my door with that sheepish grin and a new mess trailing behind him, my heart softened. I couldn't say no. I told myself, that's what mothers do. We clean up after our children no matter how big they get. And so I cleaned up the messes quietly. I sold Raymond's old tools the first year Elijah's credit card debt piled up. I picked up extra shifts folding sheets at the motel when his car was repossessed. I cashed in the small savings Raymond and I had managed to scrape together when Elijah's apartment lease fell through. And when the furnace gave out one icy winter, I did the unthinkable. I sold my engagement ring. It had sat in my jewelry box for years, a small diamond that held no great monetary value but carried decades of memories. I remember looking at it one last time, the way it used to sparkle on my hand, and convincing myself that the warmth of my child's home was more important than any sentimental keepsake. I worked nights at the diner, pouring coffee for truckers with calloused hands and listening to their travel stories while my own hands ached from the double shifts. Sleep came in fragments, my back ached in the mornings, and I learned to live without small indulgences. I stopped buying new dresses, skipped hair appointments, and convinced myself I didn't need birthday cakes anymore. It was all for Elijah. Each sacrifice carried a silent promise in my heart that he would one day find his footing and be grateful. Audrey. My youngest was different. She was the quiet, steady type, the child who rarely asked for anything. I watched her grow up with a sense of responsibility that sometimes made me feel guilty. While Elijah stumbled, Audrey soared. She studied late into the night, earned scholarships, and took part-time jobs to help pay for her own books. She never complained, never asked me for a dime. She cooked dinner when I worked overtime, helped around the house without being asked, and seemed to understand the heaviness I carried long before I could admit it myself. I always told myself that Audrey didn't need as much because she was stronger, more self-sufficient. Deep down, I knew it wasn't fair. I had poured so much of myself into fixing Elijah's problems that I often overlooked Audrey's quiet struggles. But she never made me feel guilty. She only smiled, encouraged me, and told me not to worry. When she graduated college and moved to Seattle for a well-paying tech job, I cried. Tears of pride and bittersweet joy. My little girl had made it. In the years after Raymond's death, Life became a routine of small survival tactics. Counting pennies, clipping coupons, eating modest meals, and ignoring the peeling paint on the porch because there was always something more urgent, usually tied to Elijah. Every holiday I waited by the window hoping to see both my children walking through the front gate together. But more often than not, it was Audrey's voice over the phone checking in from across the country, while Elijah's visits were brief, often followed by another request for help. Sometimes at night I stared at the empty spot on my hand where the engagement ring used to be, and wondered how many pieces of myself I had given away. Yet I always came back to the same thought. That's motherhood. You give, and in the end it's worth it. I clung to that belief like it was a lifeline. I told myself love was about sacrifice, and surely love given so freely would one day be returned in gratitude. I used to fall asleep whispering to myself, one day they'll understand. I genuinely believed it. Every jar of coins I emptied, every bill I paid for Elijah, every hour worked past exhaustion. I believed it all carried meaning. I thought one day they would look back and see the weight I carried, the sacrifices I made, and they would love me all the more for it. But life, as I was beginning to learn, doesn't always work that way. And sometimes I thought as I listened to the wind brush against the old shutters of the house Raymond built, love can feel like a one-way street paved in silence and sacrifice. I told myself it was enough. It had to be enough. Because if it wasn't, what had I been living for? Life took its natural course after Audrey moved out west, and before I could blink, Elijah was standing in my kitchen telling me about the woman he wanted to marry. Camila. She was beautiful, poised, always dressed as if heading to some important event, and had a smile that could charm anyone, at least at first. I was happy for him, truly. After all the struggles he'd faced, seeing him so full of excitement brought me a quiet joy I hadn't felt in a while. When they got engaged, Elijah didn't hesitate to ask for help with the down payment on their first home. I didn't even blink. Of course I helped. That's what mothers do. I dipped into what was left of my savings and wrote him a check with hands that shook slightly, but my heart was steady. I convinced myself this was the right thing to do. Helping my son settle down, find stability, start his own family. I didn't think twice about signing over thousands of dollars or about paying for their furniture, kitchen appliances, and even the brand new mattress they wanted. When Elijah said, "Mom, you're giving me the best start in life," I felt proud. No legal agreements, no contracts, no talks of payback, just family helping family. At first it felt good. I'd drop by the new house with fresh-baked pies, help Camilla unpack kitchen gadgets, hang curtains. But little by little the visits became fewer. The smiles more forced. Camilla started to politely but firmly remind me to call ahead before visiting. "We just need a little space to settle in, Denise," she'd say with that tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The calls came less frequently. Holidays felt more rushed. Eventually, it wasn't just about giving them space. It was about exclusion. I noticed it first when I stopped being invited to their little weekend gatherings, the barbecues where their friends came over. I'd see pictures later on Facebook, Camila beaming Elijah, flipping burgers, but my phone stayed silent. When my grandkids were born, I thought surely things would change, but visits with them became scheduled like appointments limited to an hour or two, often canceled last minute. I swallowed the hurt, because that's what mothers do. I told myself, it's their life now, don't be selfish. So I smiled through it all and comforted myself with the belief that at least they were happy. Meanwhile, Audrey called every week sometimes just to hear my voice. She'd share updates about her work, promotions, projects, new hiking trails she discovered on weekends. I could hear the pride in her voice when she talked about how far she'd come. When she got promoted to senior software engineer, her salary skyrocketed. I was proud of her in a way that went beyond motherhood. She had built her life from scratch with no help from anyone but herself. One evening, Audrey called sounding more serious than usual. "Mom, I've been thinking," she said, You've done enough for us, especially for Elijah. It's time someone took care of you. I'd like to send you $3,000 every month so you don't have to worry about bills or anything else. Just enjoy your life." My first instinct was to refuse. I wasn't raised to accept handouts, especially not from my children. But Audrey was persistent. "Mom, you never took a break. You worked yourself to the bone. Let me do this, okay? It's not charity. It's love." I wrestled with it for a few days before finally telling Elijah during one of his brief visits. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his coffee, and said with a reassuring grin, "You know, Mom, it might actually be easier if Audrey sends the money to me and I'll make sure everything gets paid on time. Property taxes, utilities, groceries. I'll handle it all for you. You've done enough running around. You should relax." At the time, it sounded practical. I was never good with online banking, and the thought of dealing with taxes and transfers felt exhausting. Elijah had always handled my property taxes after Raymond passed. I trusted him. He was my son. Why wouldn't I? Audrey agreed without much hesitation, probably thinking it was easier for me this way. She asked for Elijah's bank details and began transferring $3,000 every single month. I told myself it was a blessing. Audrey had turned out so responsible, so caring, and Elijah was finally stepping up, taking care of his mother, managing things like the man of the house Raymond always wanted him to be. The months passed, then the years, and while I didn't see any grand changes in my day-to-day life, I brushed it off. Maybe Elijah was putting money away for big bills. Maybe he was fixing things I wasn't even aware of. Every time I asked him about it, he smiled and said, "Mom, don't you worry. Everything's handled." I wanted to believe him, so I did. Meanwhile, my life remained simple, cutting back on groceries, skipping doctor visits I didn't feel were urgent, passing up little indulgences like going to the movies or buying a new coat. I told myself it was just the way things were. I never questioned where the money went because love doesn't require a ledger, or so I thought. I convinced myself that as long as Elijah and Camilla were happy, and Audrey was thriving in Seattle, my sacrifices had not been in vain. I could deal with a little loneliness with a few tightened belts because that's what mothers do. They give expecting nothing in return. At least that's what I told myself. Until everything changed. The months turned into seasons, and seasons slipped quietly into years. Before I realized it, 2 full years had passed since Audrey had made that call from Seattle, insisting on sending me money every month. And yet my life had changed very little. I still woke up early, made my own coffee from the cheapest store-brand grounds, and stretched every dollar as far as it could go. I wore the same cardigans I'd patched up more than once. My winter boots still had a tear near the heel I'd been meaning to fix. The roof leaked whenever the Tennessee storms rolled in, and I simply placed old pans beneath the drips, telling myself it wasn't worth calling a roofer. Audrey called like clockwork at least once or twice every month sometimes, just to check in sometimes to share updates from her life. Every call always ended the same way. "Mom, are you okay? Is there anything you need? Do you want me to increase the amount I send?" And every time without fail I'd answer with a smile she couldn't see through the phone. "I'm fine, honey. You're doing more than enough. Everything's perfectly fine here." The words came so easily, like second nature, but there were moments after I hung up where I stared at the faded wallpaper and wondered if I was lying to her, or to myself. I lived simply, sure, but there were days I felt trapped in simplicity. Days when I skipped getting my medications refilled because I didn't want to be a burden. Days when my knees ached climbing up the attic ladder to check on the leak, but I told myself it wasn't urgent. Days when the grocery list got shorter while the list of things I told myself I didn't really need grew longer. I kept telling myself that it wasn't their fault. Elijah had always struggled with money, and Camila, well, she had that polished look about her that probably came with expenses I couldn't imagine. Every time I saw pictures of them on social media, Elijah posing next to his brand new truck with oversized tires, Camila sipping cocktails at rooftop lounges, or the whole family skiing in Colorado, I forced myself to look away quickly, to not fall into the spiral of questions I didn't want answered. They rarely visited only on holidays, and even then it was brief. Elijah would bring some store-bought cookies. Camilla would compliment the garden while scrolling through her phone, and they would leave before the afternoon shadows grew long. When I mentioned little things like the broken fence or the old water heater making strange noises, Elijah would shrug. "You know how things are. Mom, money's tight lately. Camilla's parents needed help with their mortgage, and the kids' activities are costing a fortune." I would nod, brush it off, remind myself that they had their own pressures. They were young, raising children, trying to keep up. I told myself I understood. I told myself it was enough that Audrey cared, that Elijah did what he could, that maybe the reason I hadn't seen much change in my own life was because my bills were higher than I thought, or unexpected expenses kept popping up. I believed these things because it was easier to believe them than to face a harsher reality. Sometimes late at night when the house creaked and the wind rattled the loose shingles, doubt crept in. I thought of the promises Elijah had made at Raymond's funeral, how he said he'd take care of me, how he told me, "You'll never have to worry, Mom." I thought about the lump in my throat when I cashed out Raymond's pension to help him with his first down payment. I thought about every time I said yes, without asking for a repayment plan. And then I pushed those thoughts away, buried them beneath the weight of maternal instinct, beneath the need to believe my sacrifices had meant something. It was easier that way. Easier to imagine Elijah struggling but trying his best. Easier to believe Camilla's cold smiles were just stress, not disdain. Easier to think the money Audrey sent was going to my property taxes or insurance the way Elijah had explained. Asking questions felt dangerous, like pulling a loose thread that might unravel everything I had built my sense of family upon. So I didn't ask. I told myself stories instead. That Camilla needed to look presentable for work. That Elijah needed a reliable truck for the commute. That their vacations were gifted or paid through reward points. I ignored the obvious, looked away from the signs, and kept living quietly enough to not stir up the guilt lodged deep in my chest. I told myself it was temporary. Maybe things had been tight for them lately. Maybe they were putting some of the money away for my future. Maybe they were handling things in ways I didn't understand. Maybe, just maybe, they still loved me in the ways that mattered, in the ways that counted when it truly came down to it. I let the leaks drip. I let the clothes wear thin. I let my teeth ache when I should have seen a dentist, and I kept telling myself it's fine. They love me. They wouldn't let me go without. Yet deep in my heart there was a flicker of something I tried not to name. Doubt. Sadness. A sense of being forgotten. I whispered to myself on sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling. Maybe they're struggling more than they let on. Maybe they just don't want to worry me. I clung to that belief, wrapped it around me like a threadbare blanket, because letting go of it meant facing a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to see. And so I didn't ask, I didn't pry. I chose to believe in their goodness. I chose to hope that the love I had poured into them was still there somewhere beneath the surface. I didn't ask, but I prayed. I prayed that their hearts were kind, that their intentions were pure, that the sacrifices I made had not been in vain. I prayed that the kindness I had planted in them as children hadn't withered with age. I prayed that somewhere beneath their busy lives and expensive habits, they still remembered me, not just as the woman who gave them life, but as the mother who had given them everything. And every morning I woke up to the same quiet house, the same sagging roof, and the same gentle ache in my chest. And I told myself it was enough, because asking would be admitting the truth. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The day started like any other Sunday. The aroma of rosemary chicken drifted through the house, the potatoes roasted to just the right crispness, and the sweet tea chilled perfectly in the fridge. I had spent the morning moving slowly but purposefully, laying out the old placemats I'd had for years, folding napkins, and humming quietly to myself. Sundays always gave me a reason to pull out the nicer dishes to cook a little more than I needed, just in case Elijah and Camilla stopped by with the kids. That day I was expecting them, and my heart had settled into that familiar rhythm of cautious hopefulness, hoping for a peaceful afternoon. The knock on the door came earlier than expected, and when I opened it, there she was. Audrey. My Audrey. Coat still buttoned up against the Tennessee chill, her arms full of flowers and a bottle of wine, cheeks flushed from the cold eyes sparkling with something I couldn't quite place. "Thought I'd surprise you," she said with that smile that always seemed to melt years off my heart. I felt my throat tighten as I welcomed her inside. Elijah and Camila arrived a few minutes later, Elijah bustling in with the two grandkids, Camila with her usual polished look and brisk smile. The children darted off to the living room, the adults settled around my old dining table, the same table Raymond and I had bought from a yard sale decades ago, and patched up more times than I could count. The plates were mismatched. The chairs creaked when you leaned too hard, but there was something comforting in the familiarity. We ate and chatted, the conversation flowing easily at first. Audrey told us about a new hiking trail she'd discovered just outside Seattle, the project she'd recently finished at work, and a little weekend trip she had planned for the following month. Elijah listened, nodding along, but I noticed his eyes kept shifting toward her with something that wasn't quite admiration. Something sharper, more calculating. Camila stayed quiet occasionally, adding a comment or two, but more preoccupied with the children's manners, and keeping their elbows off the table. Dinner moved along like any other family gathering. I basked in the small warmth of having both my children under one roof, something that had become increasingly rare. I even allowed myself to believe for a brief moment that perhaps things were finally good. Perhaps we were finally whole again. But then, halfway through the meal, just as I was slicing into the peach cobbler, Audrey turned toward me, her tone as casual as if asking about the weather. "Mom," she said lightly. Her fork resting neatly on her plate, "Is the $3,000 I've been sending every month still covering everything? Or do you need more?" Time seemed to slow. I felt the fork slip slightly in my grip, my hand hovering above the dessert mid-slice. My mind scrambled to piece together what I had just heard. The words didn't make sense. My heart picked up pace as my gaze drifted from Audrey's calm, open expression to Elijah's suddenly stiff shoulders. "What money?" I asked before I could stop myself, my voice softer than I intended. The entire room seemed to freeze. Even the children, oblivious just a moment ago, turned their heads slightly, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Elijah's face paled. His fork clattered softly against his plate. Camilla's posture stiffened, her hand reaching for her glass of wine a little too quickly. I could feel the silence thickening around us like a heavy fog. Audrey blinked, confused. "The money I've been sending you? Every month since I got promoted. It's $3,000 wired directly, just like Elijah suggested, to help with property taxes, bills. Anything you need." My breath caught in my chest. The cobbler forgotten. I slowly turned my head toward Elijah, whose mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. His eyes darted around the table, searching for something to grab onto. An excuse, a lifeline. "Mom, we've been handling it." Elijah finally stammered, his voice breaking with the effort to stay composed. "You know, taking care of the important stuff, property taxes, maintenance, things like that." My heart thudded painfully. A dull, heavy ache began to settle in my chest, one that had nothing to do with age or health. The betrayal came creeping in, uninvited, unwanted, but impossible to ignore. I looked at Camila, expecting something, an explanation, maybe even a denial. But all I saw was her jaw tighten, her smile glued in place, her fingers gripping the stem of her wine glass just a little too hard. The kids fidgeted in their chairs, eyes wide, sensing the tension but not understanding it. The scent of the roasted chicken, the buttery rolls, the sweet cobbler, it all turned sour in my nose. The room, once filled with warmth and family chatter, now pulsed with silence, thick and suffocating. Audrey's gaze bounced between me and Elijah, her eyebrows knitting together in concern. You've been getting it right. I told you I'd help after my promotion, and Elijah said it'd be easier this way to just send it through him." The words echoed in my ears, and every piece fell into place with a sickening clarity. The missed dental appointments. The patched-up clothes. The leaky roof I kept telling myself wasn't urgent. The lonely birthdays with no extra cushion for celebration. I thought we were struggling together. I thought the sacrifices were shared. And yet, they weren't. Elijah's throat bobbed in a hard swallow, his shoulders slumping as he tried to meet my eyes, but failed. Camilla glanced briefly at Elijah, her lips pressing into a thin, unwavering line. Neither of them spoke another word. I sat there feeling the world tilt slightly, the table that had once been the heart of our home now serving up a harsh, bitter truth. The child I had sacrificed everything for had sacrificed my dignity without a second thought. Audrey's voice, softer now, filled the silence again. "Mom, when was the last time Elijah gave you anything?" And for the first time, I realized I had no answer. After dinner, the house felt heavier than it had ever felt before. The clatter of plates being cleared sounded distant, muffled beneath the pounding in my ears. Audrey stayed behind quietly, following me into the kitchen, while Elijah and Camilla left in a rush, mumbling something about needing to get the kids home early. I didn't stop them. I couldn't even look at them. My fingers trembled as I rinsed the plates, feeling as though my entire world had shifted under my feet. Audrey leaned against the counter, her jaw tight, her hands moving with purpose as she scrolled through her phone. The silence stretched between us, thick and raw. Then, without a word, she turned the screen toward me. I dried my hands slowly, almost afraid to see what was there. But I owed it to myself to look. "There," Audrey said softly, her voice controlled but filled with something I hadn't heard in years. Protectiveness, anger, determination. Every single month for the past 2 years, $3,000 wired from my account. I stared at the screen. It was all there. Transaction after transaction, precise, consistent. The same date every month, the same amount deposited into the same account. Elijah's account, $72,000. My knees felt weak, so I sank into the kitchen chair, gripping the edge of the table for balance. The number blinked up at me from the screen, so neat, so final. I pressed my lips together, willing my heart to steady itself, willing my breath to come evenly. I had not seen a single dollar. Not one. I had skipped my own basic needs. I had ignored leaky pipes, worn shoes, overdue medical appointments. All while Elijah and Camilla lived comfortably parading around town as the picture-perfect family while I withered in the shadows. Audrey's hand gently covered mine, her expression softening. "I didn't want to say anything before. I thought maybe you wanted it quiet, maybe Elijah was handling things like he promised. But, Mom, this isn't right. This was meant for you." My lips quivered, but I forced myself to nod. My voice barely above a whisper, I confessed I didn't know. I didn't ask. I trusted him. The weight of that admission settled into my bones. It wasn't just about money. It was about love, about respect, about the sacred trust between mother and child. I thought back to every time Elijah had reassured me, every smile, every casual pat on the shoulder as he told me not to worry. I had clung to those moments like a lifeline, convincing myself that my sacrifices had raised a good man. But now the truth sat plainly in front of me, indisputable and brutal. Audrey's features tightened. "You don't have to do this alone anymore, Mom." That night, sleep evaded me. I lay in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, listening to the familiar creaks of the old house and feeling like a fool. My memories wove in and out of the silence. Elijah's first steps, his graduation, his wedding day moments I had been so proud of. Moments I had believed proved my sacrifices were worth it. Now all I could see were the ways I had been used, overlooked, betrayed. By morning I knew what I had to do. I left early before Audrey even woke up. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as I drove through the sleepy streets of our little town, turning onto Main Street, and parking in front of the brick building with the small golden plaque, Turner and Associates. Charles Turner had been Raymond's friend, our trusted family lawyer, for decades. He had helped me navigate Raymond's estate, had drafted my will, had patiently explained legal documents when I could barely think through the haze of grief. If there was anyone I could trust now, it was him. Inside, the familiar scent of old books and polished wood greeted me. Charles's assistant offered me coffee, but I declined. My stomach was too tight to even consider it. When Charles emerged from his office, his warm, lined face broke into a gentle smile. "Denise," he greeted me kindly. "It's been a while." I nodded, sitting down across from him, feeling the weight of the years pressing on my shoulders. "I need to go over my property records," I said quietly. "Specifically the house Elijah and Camila live in. I need to know where things stand." Charles, sensing the urgency in my tone, didn't ask unnecessary questions. He pulled up the files on his computer fingers, tapping efficiently on the keyboard. As he scrolled through the documents, my heart thudded in my chest, each second stretching painfully long. Finally, he clicked open a file, adjusted his glasses, and looked up. "Well," he said calmly, "the title to your home is still clean and clear. No liens, no transfers. It's entirely under your name." My breath hitched. "And the other house?" I pressed. Charles nodded, tapping the screen. "That property, also still under your name, Denise. Remember, we prepared transfer documents when Elijah and Camila moved in, but you never signed them. You said you wanted to think about it." The memory came flooding back like a tidal wave. Sitting at this very table years ago, Elijah's convincing smile, Camila's sugary tone urging stability, family security, my hesitation, my quiet promise to Raymond to be cautious, my words, "Let me pray on it," I had never signed. A slow, disbelieving exhale escaped me, a strange mixture of relief and heartbreak. They had moved in like it was theirs. Redecorated, hosted parties, made mortgage payments in my name, acted as though they owned it. But they didn't. Not legally. Tears burned the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. I wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. "It's yours," Denise, Charles confirmed gently. "Both properties. No one can take that from you." A quiet power began to settle within me, something I hadn't felt in years. I hadn't lost everything. They hadn't stripped me of everything I had worked for. They had stolen my trust, my dignity, but not my home, not my security. I stood my shoulders just a little straighter. "Thank you, Charles." As I left his office clutching copies of the property titles, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Control. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't just a discarded mother, forgotten and used. I was Denise Morgan, a woman who had survived heartache, hardship, and now betrayal. And I had just rediscovered something precious, the power to reclaim my life. I drove home in silence, the crisp autumn air rushing through the cracked window, my fingers steady on the wheel. The old house stood waiting for me, sturdy, worn, but resilient, just like me. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe again. In the days that followed my visit to Charles's office, the house was quieter than usual, but my mind was alive with purpose. Not the kind of rage-fueled purpose that makes you shout and slam doors. No, it was calmer than that, sharper. I didn't throw things, didn't storm Elijah's house demanding answers. I let the betrayal settle into me like a steady heartbeat, each pulse reminding me of what I now knew. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't trapped. I still held the cards even if they thought I was too old, too tired, too naive to play them. I didn't pick up the phone to call Audrey. I didn't text Elijah or Camila. Instead, I took my time tending to my roses, repainting the old porch steps, baking pies in my little kitchen. I worked in silence not because I had nothing to say, but because I was choosing when to speak. There was a peculiar kind of strength in waiting and planning quietly while the world assumed you were weak. And I found comfort in that stillness. For once, I wasn't scrambling to fix someone else's mistakes. I was standing firmly in my own corner. That week I began making calls. Not the kind of frantic calls I'd made in the past when Elijah was in trouble, but deliberate, pleasant calls to friends, cousins, neighbors. I told them I was hosting a Sunday cookout, the first one in a long while. Everyone was welcome. Family, old friends from church, folks from the library committee, even Reverend Simmons. Just a simple afternoon of good food, sweet tea, and catching up. In a small town like ours, people don't need much of an excuse to gather. Word spread fast. Everyone loved a good cookout, especially when ribs and my honey-glazed cornbread were involved. People asked if something special was happening, but I smiled and said, "No, just time for some good company." That was the truth. I wasn't throwing a fit. I was inviting witnesses. On Saturday, Audrey arrived to help with the preparations. She didn't ask many questions. She knew me well enough to understand that something was brewing under the surface. Together, we set up folding tables and mismatched chairs in the backyard, wiped down the old grill, and prepped trays of food. Audrey strung up some lights between the trees while I made pitchers of sweet tea and lemonade. There was a quiet rhythm to it, like we were fortifying something, strengthening an invisible wall around us. By the time Sunday morning rolled around, the backyard looked like something out of an old country magazine. Bright tablecloths fluttered in the breeze, kids' games were set up on the lawn, and the smell of barbecue already lingered in the air. I stood by the kitchen window watching as neighbors arrived with covered dishes, their smiles warm, their laughter filling the spaces that had been too quiet for too long. Elijah and Camila arrived right on time, children in tow, smiles, wide steps, confident. Elijah wore his usual button-down and polished shoes, Camila in a sundress far too expensive for a backyard gathering. They greeted everyone like royalty, hugging cousins, shaking hands, laughing as though they hadn't been exposed for the frauds they were. Watching them work the crowd, I almost marveled at their nerve. They looked exactly like the family they had always pretended to be. Dutiful son, attentive daughter-in-law, model parents. But I knew better now. And soon everyone else would too. I welcomed them with the same smile I gave everyone else. I poured Camila a glass of sweet tea, helped Elijah set up the kids' plates. There was no frostiness in my tone, no bitterness in my gaze. I acted exactly like the doting mother they had always counted on me to be. And because I knew them so well, I knew this false comfort would lull them into security. They wouldn't see it coming. That was the beauty of it. The afternoon unfolded like any other family gathering. People ate and laughed. Cousins caught up old friends from church, shared stories. Children ran barefoot through the grass, squealing over lawn games, their cheeks flushed from the summer heat. I made my rounds smiling and chatting, dishing out extra helpings of macaroni salad, hugging folks I hadn't seen in too long. Every once in a while I caught Audrey's eye, and we shared a quiet understanding. She stayed near me helping with refills, chatting politely, but her attention never strayed too far from Elijah and Camila. She saw what I saw. Two people completely unaware that their stage was about to crumble beneath them. Elijah, with his booming laughter and flashy anecdotes, told stories of work successes and parenting triumphs. Camila leaned into conversations about charity events she was supposedly involved in, talking about committee meetings, fundraisers, and their latest home improvement project. I listened quietly, noting every embellished tale, every smug grin. I wondered if any of them ever thought about me when they painted these perfect pictures of themselves to the world. When the sun started to dip lower in the sky and the shadows stretched across the yard, I knew it was time. I stood by the grill, flipping the last few burgers, waiting for the right moment. Conversations were winding down, people settling into their chairs with second helpings of dessert. That comfortable, full-bellied lull had settled over the group. That's when I felt Audrey stand beside me. "Mom," she said, her voice calm but clear enough to ripple across the yard. "I think it's time we tell everyone what's really been going on." A hush fell almost instantly, the easy chatter cutting off like a faucet. A few people blinked, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Elijah's back stiffened as he turned toward us, his expression faltering for the first time that day. Camilla's smile faded, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. The children, blissfully unaware, continued playing in the distance. I wiped my hands on a towel, my heart steady, my resolve firm. No shouting, no scenes. Just the truth. Because sometimes the loudest statement you can make is said in absolute calm. And in that moment, I knew the years of being overlooked, dismissed, and used were over. I wasn't just a quiet old woman in the corner anymore. I was their mother, the one who still held the keys, the deeds, and her dignity. And I was done being quiet for the wrong reasons. Audrey's voice didn't waver, not even for a second. She stood tall, her back straight, chin held high the way she always carried herself in boardrooms and professional settings. But this wasn't a meeting in some high-rise office in Seattle. This was our family backyard under string lights and oak trees, surrounded by people who had known us our whole lives. And yet her voice carried with the same strength, clear and cutting through the warm evening air. For the past 2 years, she began, her eyes steady and unflinching. I've been sending $3,000 every single month for my mother, to help her with anything she needed to make sure she didn't have to worry about bills, repairs, or groceries. The hush that fell over the yard was immediate and absolute. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter evaporated. Forks hovered halfway to mouths forgotten. Heads turned, faces shifted, some with confusion, others already connecting the dots. I stood by the grill, my hands calm even as my heart thudded quietly within my chest. I watched the ripple effect unfold around me, saw the way people straightened in their chairs, the way some leaned in slightly, sensing something important was being revealed. Audrey continued unwavering. I didn't send it through the mail. Elijah said it would be simpler to send it directly to him so he could handle the bills for Mom. So every month without fail, I wired $3,000 into his account. Now all eyes swung toward Elijah. His posture had changed dramatically. Then, gone was the confidence, the smooth grin he had paraded around all afternoon. His shoulders were hunched, jaw clenched, face pale, as though every word Audrey spoke drained a little more color from him. Camilla, sitting beside him, shifted in her seat, her lips pressing together into a thin line. I noticed her hand inching toward Elijah's forearm under the table, her nails digging into his sleeve. Audrey glanced around, her tone steady, firm, professional, but laced with deep personal disappointment. And just last week I found out she paused for a second. Letting the silence settle, Mom hasn't seen a single dollar of it. A collective gasp swept through the group. Aunt June's hand flew to her chest. Cousin Dawn leaned forward, brows furrowed. Even Reverend Simmons, who had been halfway through a bite of pie, lowered his fork slowly, his gaze sharp. Camilla was the first to break the silence. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the patio, the pitch of her voice just a little too high to be convincing. Audrey, that's a serious accusation. There must be some misunderstanding. Maybe there was a banking error, or something didn't transfer correctly. We've been managing a lot. Taxes, house upkeep, the kids' school expenses. Audrey held up a single finger, and Camilla's words faltered mid-sentence. With her other hand, Audrey reached into her handbag, pulled out a folder, and calmly placed it on the nearest table. Her movements were deliberate, her body language unwavering. These, Audrey said, voice as smooth as glass, are the transfer records. Every payment, every month, with the exact account number Elijah provided me. And this, she pulled out a second sheet of paper, unfolded it carefully. Is the notarized letter Elijah sent me, claiming Mom was overwhelmed handling her own bills, and that it would be easier for him to manage everything on her behalf. Every head turned toward Elijah. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hand twitched slightly at his side, his knee bouncing nervously under the table. I took a small step forward, my palms steady, my voice quiet, but crystal clear. For the record, I said, my gaze settling firmly on Elijah and Camilla. I was never overwhelmed. I never asked for anyone to handle my finances, and I certainly never saw a penny of what Audrey sent. Gasps turned into murmurs, some people whispering to one another, shaking their heads. A few exchanged glances that clearly said we suspected something wasn't right. Camilla's face turned to stone. her lips pursed so tightly it was almost colorless. Elijah's head dropped slightly, shame beginning to take root, but I didn't care for shame. I cared for accountability. I continued keeping my tone low but unmistakably strong. Ma'am. And there's more, I said, reaching into my own folder and holding up the deed. The house you two live in. It's still mine. The title is in my name. You've played house-hosted dinners pretended ownership, but you never had it transferred. A heavy pause blanketed the yard, the kind of pause that demands attention, that pulls every eye back to me. I could see it, the shift in energy, the way people who had once thought Elijah and Camilla were responsible caring, started to see the cracks in the facade. I took in a breath, releasing the tension that had built for far too long. You have 30 days, I said calmly, my voice unwavering. 30 days to pack your things and move out of my house. I want the keys returned by the end of the month. The silence that followed was profound. It wasn't uncomfortable. Not for me. It was satisfying in a quiet, dignified way. No screaming matches, no dramatics, just simple, unfiltered truth laid bare for everyone to see. Aunt June leaned over and whispered something to Uncle Don. I noticed Reverend Simmons shaking his head in quiet disappointment. No one was rushing to defend Elijah or Camilla. The more I looked around, the more I realized how obvious it must have been to everyone but me. Or perhaps they had suspected, but no one had dared speak up. Elijah's hands curled into fists on the table, but he stayed seated, his mouth tightly shut. Camilla folded her arms, eyes narrowed, but saying nothing, knowing any words spoken now would only deepen their hole. Audrey sat down next to me, her jaw set, her expression satisfied but not gloating. She wasn't there for revenge. She was there for truth, for dignity, for fairness, for me. I turned my attention back to the grill, flipping the last of the burgers, letting the smoke curl into the soft evening sky. Around me, conversations didn't immediately resume. People sat processing their opinions, shifting their judgments, forming. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation. I wasn't the mother who had to justify sacrifices or apologize for setting boundaries. I was simply a woman reclaiming what was hers. And Elijah and Camilla, they finally understood they could no longer hide behind my silence. Word spreads quickly in a small town, especially after a family cookout turns into a public reckoning. By Monday morning, everyone from the grocery clerk to the church choir director had heard the story. But Elijah and Camilla didn't take their disgrace quietly. Instead of owning up to what they had done, they doubled down, choosing to play the only card they thought could save face: smearing my name. It started with subtle whispers at the pharmacy, little comments dropped here and there about how my memory wasn't what it used to be. Poor Denise, they would say with false sympathy dripping from their voices. She's been getting confused lately, you know. That's why Elijah was handling everything for her. Within a few days, Camilla turned it up a notch, crying crocodile tears at the town's women's group, painting themselves as victims of an old woman's forgetfulness and a daughter's vindictiveness. But the problem with lying in a close-knit community is that too many people know the truth. Folks remembered me working 2 jobs to keep a roof over my kids' heads. They remembered me showing up with hot casseroles whenever anyone lost a loved one. They remembered Raymond and me donating to church repairs, volunteering at the food pantry, helping neighbors fix their broken porches. I had lived in that town for over 40 years, and my reputation was built on decades of kindness, not a handful of carefully orchestrated lies. Audrey didn't sit back and let them control the narrative either. She took action the way any smart modern woman would, through facts and receipts. She made a calm, matter-of-fact post on her social media outlining exactly what had happened. She attached copies of the transfer statements, the notarized letter Elijah had sent her, and most importantly, never stooped to insults. Just the truth, plain and unembellished. It didn't take long for the comments to pour in. Neighbors, old classmates, members of our church community, all expressing their outrage. They hadn't known I was living in such conditions while Elijah and Camilla flaunted luxury and comfort. People who once admired Camilla's picture-perfect family posts began to question everything. Friends who had stood in line at bake sales beside Elijah now turned away. Their smiles strained their invitations to weekend poker games, quietly rescinded. The final nail in their social coffin came just a week later during a routine town council meeting. Camilla had always been front and center at local charity events, chairing committees, organizing fundraisers, basking in the praise of being a model daughter-in-law, caring for her aging mother-in-law. But now that mask had cracked and people weren't so quick to forget the truth. Reverend Simmons himself, a quiet man who rarely involved himself in gossip, made a subtle yet powerful statement by announcing publicly, "Integrity matters more than appearances." Soon after, the town's charity board politely asked Camilla to step down from her position, citing concerns about community trust. No drama, no big public confrontation. Just a quiet, undeniable shift in perception. She was no longer the adored social butterfly. She was a woman who had profited off the back of an elderly mother and got caught. Elijah's world shrank even faster. His poker group stopped calling. The hardware store owner who used to offer him discounts for being one of the good guys now avoided small talk altogether. His phone, once buzzing with invites and friendly check-ins, grew silent. The people who once praised him for stepping up to care for me now avoided his eye. Their respect replaced by quiet judgment. And me, I stayed quiet. I didn't make posts. I didn't show up at community events to set the record straight. I simply lived my life. I went about my days as I always had, shopping for groceries on Tuesdays, tending to my garden, smiling and waving to neighbors without offering explanations. When people asked how I was doing, I answered simply, "Better, thank you," and let that be enough. Because for the first time in years, I didn't have to explain my existence, justify my choices, or plead for understanding. The truth had done its work, exposing the rot beneath the shiny surface Elijah and Camilla had built. And I had learned something powerful: silence, when wielded with dignity, could be louder than any accusation. There were days when I caught glimpses of them around town. Elijah avoiding eye contact. Camilla walking briskly to her car, head down, posture tense. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the urge to confront them again. I felt peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you stood tall when others tried to drag you down. The kind of peace that comes from letting people reveal themselves without lowering your own standards. Audrey still called often, her voice full of relief that the weight had been lifted. Neighbors came by with pies. Old friends stopped to chat at the grocery store, all offering support without prying. I realized something important through it all. Sometimes you don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to demand justice to receive it. All you need is the truth, patience, and the courage to stand firm in your own dignity. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need their apologies. I needed my freedom, and now I had it. By early spring, I made the decision I had postponed for too many years. I sold the old house, the place where memories lived, but so did heartbreak. With the proceeds and the untouched deeds still under my name, I bought a little cottage by the river just a few miles outside town, but far enough that I could feel like I had truly started over. It was nothing grand. 2 bedrooms, a screened-in porch, a kitchen that needed some elbow grease. But it was mine, simple and peaceful, tucked beneath towering oak trees, with a view of slow-moving water that sparkled in the sunlight. Moving day wasn't some dramatic chapter ending. It was quiet, almost soft. I packed the few things I wanted to keep. Family photographs, my favorite books, the blue quilt Audrey had given me one Christmas, and left the rest behind. No heavy furniture weighing me down, no boxes of clutter from a life spent taking care of others. Just what I needed, and for the first time I allowed myself to believe that was enough. Audrey came down every other weekend, trading in the noise of city life for the steady rhythm of rural quiet. She didn't treat me like a fragile woman needing constant care. She treated me like a partner, a friend. We built new routines. Morning walks along the riverbank afternoons, planting vegetables in raised beds behind the cottage evenings, sipping tea on the porch while listening to the chorus of crickets. She showed me how to plant lavender for calm tomatoes for summer salads, and marigolds to keep the pests away. I taught her how to make cornbread from scratch, and she taught me how to download audiobooks on my phone. There was a quiet ease to our days. No tension, no hidden expectations, no waiting for the next phone call that would bring bad news or another financial request. The cottage became more than a home. It became a sanctuary, a space where I was no longer defined by what I gave away, but by what I reclaimed for myself. No one mentioned Elijah or Camila. Audrey didn't bring them up, and I didn't either. Their names drifted away with the seasons like dead leaves carried off by the river. I didn't ask about town gossip, didn't check in on who had seen them or what whispers floated through the church halls. I had no interest in bitterness. I had chosen something softer, something kinder peace. There were mornings when I would rise before dawn, stepping onto the porch with a warm cup of coffee, watching the first hints of orange and pink stretch across the horizon. The river moved lazily by, sometimes carrying a floating leaf or a fallen branch, sometimes nothing at all. I'd wrap myself in a knitted shawl, lean back in the old rocking chair I'd salvaged, and just breathe. The air smelled like fresh earth and dew, the kind of smell that reminded you life could be simple again if you let it. The days filled themselves without effort. I mended old clothes not because I had to, but because I enjoyed the rhythm of needle and thread. I tried new recipes baked for the neighbors who lived just far enough away to be out of sight, but close enough to wave to from the mailbox. I volunteered at the small library down the road, reading to children on Thursday afternoons, and I slept. Deep, uninterrupted sleep that wrapped me in comfort instead of worry. For the first time in decades, I didn't carry anyone else's burdens. I didn't lie awake wondering how I would cover someone else's bills. I didn't check my phone in dread of the next favor being asked. My world had shrunk in the best possible way. Just me, my garden, a cozy home, and the daughter who reminded me that love could be steady and real without taking everything from you. Audrey often teased me about becoming a small-town recluse, but I could hear the warmth in her voice, the relief in her laughter. She said I sounded happier than I had in years, and she was right. There was something profoundly healing about sitting beneath a sky full of stars, knowing no one expected anything from me except to simply be. I had learned finally that peace doesn't come from keeping everyone happy. It comes from knowing you are no longer responsible for people who take without giving. It comes from saying no without guilt, from reclaiming your time, your energy, your space. And so, I lived quietly tending to my plants, reading good books, baking when I felt like it, resting when I needed it. I stopped measuring my days by who I had pleased, and instead measured them by how often I smiled, how deeply I slept, how fully I breathed. There was a freedom in letting go of what no longer served me, and in that freedom I found myself again, not as someone's mother, someone's bank, someone's fallback plan, but simply as Denise. And for the first time in a long, long while, that was more than enough. It's funny how life teaches you lessons in the quietest of ways. Sitting on my little porch by the river, watching the sunlight bounce off the water, I began to realize things I'd never given myself permission to consider. For most of my life, I thought being a good mother meant giving until there was nothing left. I believed love was measured in sacrifices, in how much you could endure without complaint. I told myself that being taken for granted was part of the deal, that if you gave enough, your children would love you in return. But I was wrong. Children need love. Yes, they need comfort, support, guidance. But love isn't a blank check. It's not a bottomless well meant to be drained dry. Love must come with respect, or else it becomes something else entirely, an obligation, a burden, a leash. And no mother should live her life feeling like she's owed nothing in return for everything she's given. I didn't need to burn bridges to learn this. I didn't need to scream or cause scenes or seek revenge. I simply had to stop letting myself be taken advantage of. I had to remember I was more than a provider, more than a rescuer. I was a person with worth, with dignity, with dreams of my own, even at 65. Looking back, I realized how many years I'd lost to guilt, to misplaced loyalty. I had stayed quiet when I should have spoken up. I had given without boundary, thinking it made me good when really it just made me easy to use. And for what? The approval of people who never intended to value me, the affection of a son who had long ago replaced love with expectation. No more. I didn't hate Elijah. I didn't curse Camila's name. I didn't wish them suffering or hardships. I simply removed myself from the equation. I no longer played the role of the ATM mother, the invisible caregiver, the safety net always ready to catch them when they fell. I set down the burdens they had so comfortably placed on my shoulders, and I walked away lighter, freer. In my cottage, surrounded by simple things that brought me joy, I discovered something beautiful. I was allowed to live just for me. I was allowed to smile without faking it, to rest without guilt, to spend my time on things that fed my soul rather than drained it. I learned to laugh again, to savor the crisp morning air, to feel proud of the life I'd built after so many years of putting others first. Audrey would visit, and sometimes I'd catch her looking at me with a quiet smile. "You seem lighter," she'd say, and I knew she was right. I didn't need to be everything for everyone anymore. I just needed to be true to myself. I often wondered why it had taken me so long to realize this simple truth. Maybe because mothers are conditioned to believe selflessness is the highest virtue. Maybe because we measure our success by how happy we make everyone else. Maybe because somewhere along the line we forget that our happiness matters too. But I remembered now. I had made my choice, not out of spite, not out of vengeance, but out of self-respect. I chose to reclaim my life, to live the years I had left in peace and dignity. I chose to honor my own needs after decades of ignoring them. I chose to finally listen to the quiet voice inside me that whispered, "You matter too." Sacrifice is a beautiful thing when it's done freely and with love. But sacrifice should never be demanded, never be expected, and certainly never be abused. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it nonetheless. And so I lived, quietly, peacefully, on my own terms. Now I ask you, have you ever loved someone so much that you lost pieces of yourself along the way? Have you ever given so much that you forgot you were allowed to keep some of that love for yourself? If you have, maybe it's time to ask yourself the same question I did. When will you finally take back your dignity? Because love should never require losing yourself, and sacrifice should never be an excuse to be mistreated. I found my peace when I remembered my worth. Maybe it's your turn now. ChatGPT said, "Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever felt overlooked after giving your all to your family, if you've ever wondered when it would be your time to live for yourself, then you understand my journey. Have you ever stayed silent just to keep the peace, or sacrificed so much you forgot what your own happiness looked like? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments below. Let's remind each other that our feelings are valid, and it's never too late to reclaim our dignity. If stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story about strength, healing, and rediscovering self-worth. Your journey matters. Your voice matters. And you are never alone.